a number of the conventional fields have peaked and are it's starting to cost somewhat more to pump oil from them. That may be the case, but I don't think that fact is what's really going to put the pressure on oil demand or decisions about supply. One thing that will be very big with respect to demand is China and India, especially China. The United States, we have roughly 800 cars for every 1,000 people. China has about 8 cars for every 1,000 people. And last year, for the second straight year, Chinese bought more new cars than the United States citizens did. So the possibility of there being millions and millions of more drivers and cars on the road in China and in other countries as well, I think is probably going to be more determinative of oil supply and than the peaking issue.
The International Energy Agency recently said that in order to continue at the current levels of oil supply, not even to raise them, but to continue as we are now, in about 20 years, we would have to find about 4 to 5 new Saudi Arabias to continue with what we were asking now. Is that alarming to you?
Well, yes and no. First of all, it kind of depends on what one considers a Saudi Arabia. The OPEC, which the Saudis effectively head, has close to 80% of the world's conventional oil reserves, and it's pumping about 40% of the oil because they're withholding oil from the market in order to be able to raise prices. They're a conspiracy and restraint of trade.
Is that deceitful in your opinion? You
Well,
recently
it's illegal under American law and ought to be under the WTO, but people won't challenge the Saudis or OPEC on it because they need their oil. The OPEC is pumping less oil today than it did in the late 1970s, and demand has gone way up since then. So they're withholding a lot of oil from the market. Now, I think that if we don't take steps with respect to alternative fuels and using natural gas in trucks and electrification, plug-in hybrids, for example, and improvements in internal combustion engines efficiency. If we do all those things, we could see demand go down substantially for transportation fuels from oil-based transportation fuels from where we are today. But if we don't take any of those steps, then that kind of horror story from the IAEA, I'm sorry, the International Energy Agency, could well be true.
So it could lead the world economy into the ground. But you also mentioned that oil has has enormous impacts politically. For example, its money is used to fund terrorism, and you also even gave a link with cancer. Can you explain that to us?
Cancer is kind of interesting. Not many people know about this. Boyden Gray, who was White House counsel to first President Bush and second President Bush's ambassador to the European Union, is a very thorough and scholarly man. He has had an article out, very heavily footnoted for several years now, that points out that the so-called aromatics, benzene, toluene, xylene, that are used to enhance octane in gasoline, it's that sweet smell that you smell when you're pumping gasoline. Those so-called aromatics are extremely carcinogenic. If you're running an industrial plant and something like that leaks out, you're in big trouble with the EPA. But they've never regulated it with respect to automobiles. And if we used alcohol fuels, such as methanol, say made from natural gas, or ethanol, made from any of a number of sources, to get octane up, and they have high octane too, rather than using the so-called aromatics, we'd have a lot less cancer, Boyden writes. He says tens of thousands of early deaths every year in the United States because the oil companies are permitted to use these aromatics to enhance octane. And That's just one reason we ought to move off oil as much as we possibly can.
Right. You also mentioned the fact that oil is being used to fund Al Qaeda and the Wahhabists. Wahhabism being an extreme offshoot of Islam.
Yes, the Wahhabi doctrine that is regnant in Saudi Arabia points the world toward a caliphate, a theocratic dictatorship, essentially. Considers homosexuals and apostates to deserve death. Is extremely brutal in many, many ways toward women, extremely hostile to other religions in many ways. It's essentially the same substantive views that Al Qaeda holds. The difference between the Wahhabis of Saudi Arabia and Al Qaeda's beliefs is not a substantive difference. It's a disagreement about who should have power, who should be running things, sort of like the disagreement between the Trotskyites and the Stalinists in the 20s and 30s, who also hated each other and killed each other. Because, according to Lawrence Wright, who wrote a very fine book about 9/11 and Al Qaeda called The Looming Tower, Wright says in there that with between 1% and 2% of the world's Muslims, the Saudis control about 90% of the world's Islamic institutions,
Wow.
Including schools. So that means that what those mainly little boys are being taught in school, and even to aspire to be suicide bombers, is substantively what Al Qaeda would teach them. Everything except who should have the power.
And they're being funded by the Saudis.
They're being, according to Wright, 90% of the world's Islamic institutions are funded essentially by the Saudis. And so what that means is that you and I and citizens of all oil importing countries are effectively paying for both sides in this war against Islamist terrorism, whatever extremism, whatever you want to call it, because we're paying indirectly for those schools, as well as paying for security measures and whatever else we're doing to try to keep terrorist attacks from happening.
So what's the solution? People are talking about natural gas. They're talking about alternative energies. What should the world do or individual countries do to get rid of the oil dependency?
Well, two things that will not help are cap and trade. That's a reasonable way to shift toward cleaner ways to make electricity. I think there are better ways, but that's what it's for. It has really nothing to do with getting us off oil. Adding $1 a ton to the price of CO2 adds a penny a gallon at the pump, so it's negligible. And another thing that is largely irrelevant is how we make electricity. You may like nuclear power plants or wind farms, and there are good reasons for moving to one or both to produce electricity, but only about 1% of American electricity comes from burning oil. So you can change how you produce electricity till the cows come home, and you're not going to have any particular effect on oil. What you need to do is start using other fuels and break down the barriers that keep us from using other fuels. We ought to be able, by having a different kind of plastic in the fuel lines of cars, let them operate not just on gasoline but on alcohol fuels like methanol, like I say, maybe from natural gas or ethanol from a number of sources. We ought to be vigorously pursuing other biofuels. Some of the most interesting ones now are made diesel and aviation fuel made from algae, particularly non-photosynthetic algae. You also, I think, want to move as quickly as one can toward electrification. I have two plug-in hybrids, essentially, a Chevy Volt, which is called a range-extended electric car, and a Prius that's been converted to have an extra battery. So I can drive on the sunlight from my roof a fair amount of the time, which is stored in batteries in the basement of our farmhouse. I think electrification is going to take some time, but it's a very good solution, and the batteries keep getting better and keep getting cheaper. That's the major expenditure for it.
Right. We have a company here in Israel that Israelis are putting a lot of their hopes in, which is called Better Place. I'm sure as an investor, you know it. Do you have any opinion about it? Do you believe in what it's doing? Do you believe it can make Israel the first country to run solely on electric cars?
Well, Better Place is a very interesting company. The venture fund where I was until the end of last year, when I switched to one in New York, is invested in Better Place. So I know a bit about them. The idea is to have a lot of charging stations so that one can publicly available, so that one can charge the battery whenever it starts to run down, and then if you get in a real pinch, to be able to pull into one of the battery swapping stations and have your battery taken out and another one that's full of electricity put in, full of charge, in about the same amount of time it would take you to fill a gasoline tank. And that battery swapping feature, I think, will quite possibly work well in Israel, in Denmark, in places with a relatively limited concern about range inadequacy for the
Small
electricity.
countries.
Yeah, but I'm not sure how well that works in West Texas, let's say. But I think it may be a very promising approach for Israel, for Denmark, and perhaps for a number of other places as well.
Right. Thank you. I want to move back to some more interesting questions for me. Anyway, I wanted to know if you ever watch Hollywood movies about the CIA and what you think of them, because I watch them and I get so excited, but I'm thinking perhaps it's not reality at all. Do you ever watch them and say, "Oh, that's BS"?
Yes, I've seen a number, and very few have anything really to do with the intelligence business and what it's really like. The far and away best movie, from my point of view, about intelligence and people's motivations and how an intelligence service works and so forth, is a German film, Das Leben der Anderen, The Lives of Others, that
Right.
won
Great
an Academy
movie.
Award for a best foreign film in
Lives
the
of
U.S.
Others.
about 5 years ago. I think it's superb, and most films about intelligence sacrifice reality for either technical wizardry that's great fun, or action that is also great fun and entertaining, but has very little to do with what actually goes on in the
So I
intelligence
shouldn't
business.
believe everything I see.
I would not, no. I wouldn't, not even close.
God, and I wanted to know some secrets. Maybe if I become your friends, you might tell me some secrets.
Well,
I'll take him out to Tel Aviv, getting something to drink, and find out some secrets.
oh, I've forgotten all the ones I knew. I've been away from the business for 15 years.
Do you plan on taking them to the grave with you, or are you ever planning on
Well,
writing anything about your experience?
Probably not going to write anything. This is, I work on energy now, and I've been doing that for over 10 years. And a lot of the things that one knows and learns about in these senior government jobs have a relatively short half-life, even if it's something that's really extremely important. It will often only really be important for months to years, not decades, and with a few exceptions. So I have no plans to be writing on any of those issues. I'm doing energy now.
Well, maybe we can convince you. But in the meantime, thank you so much for joining us, James. It was great. That was James Woolsey, former director of the CIA with the IDC Radio 106.4. Thanks.
Okay, good.